Okay, so you've given us this really interesting collection of sources all about how governments reacted to these huge economic crises after 1900. And it seems like there are some like really important lessons we can still learn from them today.
Oh, absolutely.
Like just thinking about how different countries dealt with these like crazy economic problems and the effects of the decisions they made are still felt, even now.
Yeah, this period is like a total turning point in economic history. We see these systems that were, thought to be super solid just crumbling under this immense pressure, you know, and it forced governments to take these really radical and oftentimes pretty desperate measures.
Yeah,
Your sources really focus on three main areas. First is that hyperinflation spiral in Germany after World War I, right?
right.
The second is the Soviet Union's attempt to totally reshape its economy, from the top down. And then the third is the worldwide disaster of the Great Depression and all those different and totally opposite ways governments tried to deal with it.
Yeah.
So in this deep dive, what we want to do is go deeper than just, telling the story of what happened.
Okay.
We really want to figure out, like, what were the main things that caused these crises?
Yeah.
How effective were the different approaches governments took? And what was the human cost of those policies?
Right.
And basically, we want to see if we can pull out some key insights from this super important period.
Okay. Yeah, so let's start unpacking this.
Okay.
Let's start with Germany after World War One. Like, the level of economic devastation there is just mind-blowing. The Treaty of Versailles hit them with these absolutely massive reparations payments.
Yeah, reparations on a scale
Yeah.
meant to, cover the immense costs the Allies racked up during the war.
Yeah.
What your sources really point out is that Germany basically took this huge gamble. They were banking on winning the war. They thought they could, grab resources from other countries to cover these potential costs. And, well, obviously that gamble failed spectacularly.
Totally. Yeah, and so their main response to this crushing debt was just to print more money. It sounds almost ridiculous, like something out of a bad economics textbook, but the results were devastating.
Oh, yeah.
Prices were going up like trillions of times. Can you even imagine like trying to buy groceries with inflation that bad?
Yeah, it's a really clear example of a government facing this, like, seemingly impossible financial burden and just hitting the print button as this, like, quick fix.
Right.
But what the sources show us is just how connected the global financial system already was, even back then.
Yeah.
Germany couldn't pay its debts, and that had this ripple effect.
Yeah.
It really hurt France and Great Britain's ability to pay back their own war debts to the U.S.
Wow.
And then we can't forget about the Soviet Union. They just straight up refused to pay back the debts from the Tsarist era. They basically said, look, the communist revolution was a clean break from the past, so those debts, they don't apply to us anymore.
Wow, that's a bold move.
Yeah,
And it wasn't just the major powers in Europe that were hurting, right?
right.
The material you gave me also talks about how all this impacted colonial governments. Because their economies were so tied to those of their imperial rulers, they were also hit really hard as Europe went through these crises. It really shows just how interconnected the global economy was even back then.
Yeah, exactly. So many colonial economies were set up to, pretty much just serve the economic needs of those imperial powers. So when those powers started struggling, the consequences were felt immediately all across their empires.
Yeah.
It added this whole other layer of difficulty to an already widespread problem.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, though. The sources also mention that Germany actually stabilized for a bit around 1924. The U.S. started loaning them money, which gave them some much-needed relief and led to a pretty quick economic recovery. But, as we'll see, that stability didn't last very long.
That's a great transition, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it leads us right to the Soviet Union. They had a completely different approach to managing their economy. After their own, really intense economic collapse after the revolution, Lenin introduced this thing called the New Economic Policy, or NEP,
Right.
in 1923. And the sources describe it as having these, like, limited free market principles, but with a big catch.
Yeah, with the really important caveat that all the major parts of the economy, things like big industries, banks, and foreign trade, all that stayed firmly under the control of the state.
Okay, so like a hybrid system.
Kind of, yeah. And what's really interesting here is Lenin's reasoning. You see, he saw the NEP, this seeming step back towards the free market, as a temporary but absolutely crucial move.
Okay.
It was meant to give the communist revolution time to solidify and let the economy recover a bit. I mean, you got to remember, in the Soviet Union, the idea of a free market went against everything they believed in. But Lenin was pragmatic. He knew they needed to get the economy back on track.
So he was willing to bend the rules a little.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
But the sources suggest that the NEP had mixed results. And then, of course, Lenin died in 1924.
Right.
That's a big turning point because that's when Joseph Stalin comes to power.
Okay.
And Stalin's approach to the economy, well, let's just say it was anything but limited. He was laser focused on rapid industrialization, and his main tool for making that happen was the five-year plan.
Yeah, the 5-year plan. I mean, to try and increase industrial output 5 times over in just 5 years, that's insanely ambitious.
It was ambitious, and it was achieved through like really harsh and brutal methods, as your sources describe. Stalin's vision for rapid industrialization meant that Soviet society and its entire economic foundation had to be completely restructured, and he was willing to use force to do it.
Yeah, and to feed all those new industrial centers and provide them with workers, he introduced collectivization in agriculture, which basically meant taking small, privately owned farms and merging them into these huge, state-run collective farms.
Exactly. And this is where the human cost of this economic transformation gets truly horrifying. The kulaks, who were basically the wealthier peasants who owned land, put up a big fight against this forced collectivization.
Right.
And Stalin's response was absolutely brutal. Your sources talk about an estimated 8 million people being arrested, countless executions, and people forced into labor camps with horrific conditions.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that.
It was incredibly brutal, and it was totally intentional. The goal wasn't just to take the kulaks' land. It was to get rid of anyone who might oppose Stalin's plan to completely change agriculture.
Yeah.
But your sources highlight that there were devastating economic consequences, too.
Oh, right. Yeah.
You see, a lot of the peasants who were left didn't know how to manage these big farms, or they just weren't motivated to work hard. And that led to these huge shortages in food production across the country.
And that brings us to the Holodomor, the famine in Ukraine in 1932 and 33. Ukraine was this incredibly fertile region. It was like the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. But during the Holodomor, the population was absolutely devastated by starvation. Some estimates say the population was cut in half.
It's hard to believe.
It's just awful. And the fact that even as millions of people were starving, the government was taking the grain that was produced and even exporting it. Plus, they were stopping people from leaving their villages to try to find food. It just shows a level of cruelty that's hard to comprehend.
It really highlights the total control the Soviet state had over the economy and the lives of its citizens under Stalin. The fact that they pushed forward with industrialization, even at the cost of millions of lives lost to starvation, it's a chilling example of what can happen when economic planning becomes so all-encompassing and authoritarian. And it raises these really difficult questions about the ethics of completely transforming an economy and whether human life is truly valued in systems like that.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. Okay, so let's shift gears now. We've talked about Germany after World War I and then the Soviet Union. Now let's move on to the Great Depression, this global upheaval that hit pretty much everyone.
Okay.
Leading up to the Depression, the U.S. economy was booming. It played a big part in helping the world recover after World War I. And then, bam, the stock market crashes in 1929, and the whole global economic order starts to fall apart. The unemployment and poverty in the U.S. during that time was just on a scale that's hard to grasp even now.
The crash of '29 was a major turning point. It showed just how fragile that economic recovery of the 1920s really was, and it really highlighted how connected the global financial system had become.
Yeah.
What's striking is how quickly a downturn in one big economy, like the U.S., could turn into a worldwide crisis.
Right.
And the initial response in the U.S., even though it was maybe intended to help protect American businesses, ended up having a negative effect globally.
Right, you're talking about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, right? The idea was to shield American industries from competition by putting these really high taxes on imports. But what actually happened was...
International trade basically froze up.
Mm-hmm.
Other countries were facing their own economic problems, and they retaliated by putting up their own trade barriers. This caused global trade to plummet, which just made the economic crisis even worse all around the world.
So it backfired.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
And the sources you gave me really emphasize that a lot of countries, especially the ones still recovering from World War I, depended heavily on investments and trade from the U.S. So when that dried up, it caused widespread problems. And just like we saw with Germany's struggles after World War I, the colonial economies were hit hard once again because they were so closely tied to their imperial powers. It's like a recurring theme in all of this.
Yeah, it's like this constant reminder of just how interconnected the global economy was and still is. And the Great Depression really forced people to rethink the way they thought about economics. The idea of laissez-faire, this hands-off approach to government involvement in the economy, that just didn't cut it in the face of such a huge crisis.
Yeah.
We start to see this really big shift towards more active government intervention.
Right, because that massive economic collapse made it clear that the free market just couldn't fix itself quickly enough.
Mm,
This was causing all sorts of social unrest and political instability across the globe. And that's what created the space for governments to step in and try all sorts of things, from democratic reforms to authoritarian crackdowns.
right.
The sources you found offer three really interesting examples of these different approaches.
Okay, so let's dive into those. Let's start with the New Deal in the United States under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The sources talk about how quickly they put all these government programs into action. Things like putting millions of people to work on infrastructure projects like building roads and bridges and setting up important social safety nets like retirement and health insurance for the elderly and kids.
Right.
It was a huge change in how the U.S. government was involved in people's lives.
It was a total change, a big shift from that traditional limited role the federal government had in the U.S. economy.
Yeah.
The whole point of the New Deal was to give immediate help to people who were unemployed, to boost the economy with government spending, and to put these long-term reforms in place to hopefully prevent another crisis like this from happening again.
Right.
But there's this ongoing debate, that your sources probably touch on, about whether the New Deal actually succeeded in ending the Depression.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
I mean, yeah, it definitely provided relief for a lot of people, and it laid the groundwork for the modern welfare system in the U.S. But a lot of historians and economists think that it was actually World War II that really got the U.S. economy back on track.
Interesting. Okay, so then we have these fascist, corporatist economies that popped up in places like Italy under Mussolini and Germany under Hitler. This was a whole different model of how a government could intervene in the economy.
Right, fascist regimes implemented a corporatist economic system. What they did was they took control of all the key parts of the economy and organized them into these corporations.
Okay.
Now, these weren't like the corporations we think of today. They were more like these bodies that included people from businesses, workers, and the government.
Okay.
The idea was to unite the country, to get rid of class conflict, and to put the needs of the nation above individual needs. It was also about getting ready for war, like really aggressively preparing for military expansion.
So the government had a lot of control.
Oh, yeah. While private property still existed on paper, the government was really calling the shots when it came to production and investment. Everything was geared towards achieving those national goals.
And what did that mean for individual workers? Did they have any rights?
Well, not really. Independent labor unions were usually shut down, and workers' rights were severely limited. Basically, everything in the economy was directed towards the political and military goals of the state. This whole system helped these fascist regimes solidify their authoritarian power over the economy and society, and it played a big part in enabling them to rearm quickly and pursue those expansionist policies they were known for.
So it was all about control and power. Okay, so the last example the sources talk about is governments that had strong popular support and used state-led development, like in Brazil under Getulio Vargas and in Mexico with Lázaro Cárdenas. It seems like they tried to mix government intervention with policies that would make them popular with workers and peasants.
Yeah, what's really interesting here is how they strategically used government intervention and economic reforms to gain political loyalty and reduce their dependence on foreign countries.
So they were trying to gain more independence.
Exactly. One big example is Mexico nationalizing its oil industry. They created Pemex, a state-owned oil company. They also implemented big land redistribution programs, which is a major move towards economic sovereignty, and addressed what the people were demanding. And in Brazil, Vargas was all about industrializing the country quickly with government support. He also enacted labor laws that benefited urban workers.
So they were trying to improve conditions for the working class.
Yeah, and while these policies definitely led to more government control over the economy and a surge in nationalism, they also gained a lot of support from the lower classes.
Okay, so looking back at all of this, at this really chaotic period between the world wars, what would you say is the biggest takeaway?
I think the biggest takeaway is that these economic crises, they basically shattered the old ways of thinking about economics and forced governments everywhere to totally rethink their role in managing the economy. We saw a huge range of responses, from the Soviet Union's extreme, centrally planned and brutally enforced system to the more hands-on capitalism of the New Deal in the U.S., and then the state-directed economies of fascist regimes and populist governments in Latin America. Each approach had its own set of consequences, some intended and some not, and they often came with a big human and political cost.
It kind of shows that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to an economic crisis.
Right. I mean, the approaches were so different, driven by completely different political systems and ideologies, and the outcomes were just as varied.
So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to learn from all of this?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, when we look at the successes, and maybe more importantly, the failures of these historical responses to economic crises, what lessons can we take away about the role of government in dealing with big economic problems?
Right.
And how do these examples help us understand the economic issues and debates we're facing in the world today? That's something to really think about.
It really is food for thought. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
Oh, you're welcome. It was great talking about this with you.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. Until next time.